You begin with the assumption that certainty is evidence of truth. You feel stable when your beliefs are firm, confident when your conclusions are fixed, and secure when your worldview is consistent. Certainty appears to be a strength. Yet if you examine your own experience honestly, you notice that certainty often arises before genuine understanding does. It appears quickly. It clings strongly. It resists questioning. Al-Ghazali recognized this pattern early in his intellectual life. He saw that certainty can function not as the result of clear reasoning, but as a psychological shield against the discomfort of uncertainty. You begin to ask, is your certainty coming from truth, or from your need to avoid what truth might require? Al-Ghazali lived among scholars who prized certainty. Theologians argued with conviction. Philosophers insisted on the authority of logic. Jurists defended rigid interpretations. Each group believed that doubt was a threat and that certainty proved correctness. But Al-Ghazali noticed something subtle. People used certainty to avoid confronting contradictions in their own thinking. The stronger their certainty, the less they examined their assumptions. This environment revealed a hidden mechanism. Certainty can prevent inquiry instead of concluding it. As Al-Ghazali examined his own beliefs, he discovered that the convictions he held most tightly were often the least investigated. He felt certain because certainty was familiar, not because the belief was verified. You begin to see the same pattern in yourself. Some beliefs feel obviously true, yet when you try to justify them, the justification is thin. Certainty appears before evaluation. It hides the lack of examination underneath. This realization disturbed Al-Ghazali. He saw that the mind can attach to certainty not because it has reached truth, but because it wants to stop questioning. Thus begins the central danger. Certainty can function as a barrier to clarity. Certainty feels stable. It gives the impression of coherence. It provides relief from the complexity of thought. This makes certainty psychologically attractive. But this attractiveness is not the same as truth. Al-Ghazali studied how certainty works internally. He recognized that certainty often arises from repetition rather than verification. When you repeat a belief long enough, it begins to feel true. Familiarity becomes indistinguishable from accuracy. You begin to notice this mechanism in your own mind. When a conclusion aligns with your habits, you feel certain. When it aligns with your identity, you feel certain. When it aligns with your desires, you feel certain. But none of these feelings reflect truth. They only reflect comfort. Certainty becomes a trap when it stabilizes your worldview before your worldview is fully examined. Instead of helping you understand, it stops you from questioning. Instead of bringing clarity, it blocks the possibility of further insight. This leads to the unsettling recognition. Certainty can arise from psychological preference rather than objective understanding. You begin to examine why certainty appears so quickly. When you look closely, you see that certainty often appears as a defense. It protects you from confusion, contradiction, and vulnerability. Certainty stabilizes identity. It gives structure to your self-image. Al-Ghazali recognized the same in himself. When he felt uncertain, he did not just question his ideas, he questioned his adequacy. Certainty allowed him to feel competent and secure. But this security was not grounded in truth. It was grounded in avoidance. You begin to observe how certainty functions defensively in your own mind. When a belief is questioned, you feel an urge to defend it before evaluating the question. When a contradiction appears, you try to reinterpret it rather than explore it. This impulse is not intellectual, it is protective. Certainty protects the self more than it protects truth. That is why the mind clings to it. Al-Ghazali saw that true inquiry requires the willingness to feel temporarily unstable. Without this willingness, certainty becomes a trap that prevents growth. the deeper insight emerges. Certainty that requires protection is not certainty, it is fear. As Al-Ghazali continued examining his beliefs, he experienced a crisis. Certainties that once felt unshakable began to dissolve. He saw contradictions between doctrines. He saw limitations in logic. He saw biases in his own reasoning. The collapse of his certainty felt destabilizing, but it forced him into intellectual honesty. You begin to notice similar moments in your own thinking. When you confront contradictory evidence, your certainty weakens. When your assumptions fail under scrutiny, they collapse. When you ask deeper questions, your earlier answers fall apart. This collapse is not failure. It is the exposure of false foundations. Certainty built on avoidance collapses easily. Certainty built on habit collapses quickly. Certainty built on identity collapses painfully. But certainty built on truth does not collapse at all. It remains stable even when questioned. Al-Ghazali realized that the collapse of illusion is necessary for the arrival of truth. No structure built on false premises can support genuine clarity. This leads to a new question. What if the collapse of your certainty is not the loss of truth, but the removal of what obstructed it? At the moment when certainty collapses, something unexpected becomes possible. Genuine inquiry. Doubt, which you once feared, becomes a source of clarity. Doubt removes what certainty protected. It exposes assumptions you never examined. Al-Ghazali understood that doubt becomes dangerous only when it is resisted. When accepted, it becomes the gateway to understanding. Doubt dissolves imitation. It dismantles inherited belief. It reveals the unexamined layers of thought. You begin to see doubt differently. It is not the loss of stability but the beginning of honest vision. When certainty dissolves, perception expands. You become capable of seeing possibilities that certainty once blocked. You recognize contradictions you previously ignored. You discover that your clarity does not depend on having immediate answers. It depends on the willingness to question. Doubt becomes a cleansing movement. It removes the noise that prevented insight. It prepares the mind for direct recognition. And so a deeper insight emerges. Certainty collapses so that understanding can begin. As certainty dissolves and doubt clarifies, the heart, not as emotion but as the faculty of direct perception, begins to operate. Al-Ghazali recognized that the heart perceives what the intellect cannot justify. The heart does not function through argument or evidence. It functions through recognition. You notice this shift within yourself. After the collapse of rigid certainty, you feel more capable of perceiving truth directly. You no longer depend solely on conceptual analysis. You begin to sense what is real without requiring the mind to verify it. This is not irrationality. It is a reordering of internal authority. The mind is no longer the source of truth. It becomes the interpreter of what the heart perceives. The heart outgrows the mind's rigid frameworks and points toward deeper understanding. Al-Ghazali emphasized that certainty must eventually move from the intellect to the heart. Intellectual certainty is vulnerable. It requires constant reinforcement. But the heart's certainty is quiet and stable. It does not collapse under questioning because it does not depend on conclusion. It depends on direct recognition. This reveals the mechanism hidden beneath certainty's collapse. The mind loses certainty so the heart can gain clarity. Once the heart begins to perceive without the interference of rigid thought, a new form of certainty appears. This certainty does not resemble the old one. It is not aggressive. It is not defensive. It does not need to be proven. It is stable not because it is reinforced, but because it is not threatened. Al-Ghazali experienced this shift when he realized that truth does not depend on the strength of his argument. It depends on the absence of distortion. As his illusions dissolved, A quiet certainty appeared, a certainty grounded in direct awareness rather than intellectual construction. You begin to observe this in yourself. The certainty that arises now feels light. It does not need affirmation. It remains even when the mind questions it. It is not made of conclusions. It is made of clarity. This certainty cannot be shaken because it is not held tightly. It cannot be threatened because it does not defend itself. It does not collapse because it does not rest on assumptions. A new understanding becomes clear. Certainty is stable only when it is not manufactured. Eventually, you recognize the full mechanism of certainty. False certainty forms quickly, defends itself aggressively, collapses easily, and leaves confusion behind. Genuine certainty forms slowly, requires no defense, does not collapse, and leaves clarity behind. Al-Ghazali saw that the transition from false certainty to real certainty requires surrender, the surrender of the mind's claim to authority. The intellect cannot force real certainty. It can only remove what blocks it. Certainty arrives when the mind stops insisting on controlling the process. You begin to understand this directly. When you stop clinging to beliefs, they become easier to examine. When you stop defending conclusions, they become easier to refine. When you stop demanding certainty, clarity becomes possible. Surrender is not passivity. It is openness. The mind becomes available for truth rather than inflexible in its assumptions. This availability allows certainty to arise naturally rather than artificially. And now the final realization becomes clear. Certainty is not constructed, it is recognized. As the inquiry settles, the tension between doubt and certainty dissolves. You no longer cling to rigid belief. You no longer fear the collapse of assumptions. You see that truth does not need protection. It only needs space. Al-Ghazali understood that the mind becomes quiet when it stops claiming certainty it does not possess. In that quiet, understanding appears without force. Certainty arises without assertion. Awareness becomes steady without effort. The trap of certainty ends when certainty is no longer required. What remains is clarity without resistance. And in that clarity, stillness unfolds naturally.